I'm the project coordinator at the Ontario Museum Association, and we are very pleased to welcome you to this first webinar as part of our work to support a strong, collaborative, and inclusive museum sector. I would like to first acknowledge that Toronto, where the only offices are and where I am broadcasting from, has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. This sacred land is the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across the island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community on this territory. I want to start by making sure that everyone knows how to participate. You will see slides and you will hear the presenters speak. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment to the presenters, simply type your message into the chat box at the right side of your screen and select Send. As moderator, I will be monitoring the chat, and we will do our best to ensure that all of your questions are answered. There will be time to address questions and answers after the presentation. Before started, I would like to recognize the project partners, the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration for funding this Museum Inclusive Leadership Project. As part of this project, I'd like to mention the Inclusive Museum Toolkit, which we'll be launching in March 2018. This toolkit is being developed by 10 partner museums from across the province, with feedback drawn from the experience of experts and innovators on our project advisory committee, as well as from within their communities. Many of these project participants are joining us here today, as well as some of the wider OMA membership. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all. This webinar will be cultural competence. We'll be examining the imperative for developing cultural competence for all staff and provide key concepts in developing cultural competence. We'll also come to understand cultural dimensions, discuss how to measure cultural competence, and techniques for developing greater intercultural understanding. So we're very fortunate to have our presenter with us today. Kath Gallagher-Louisi is Senior Director Consulting for the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. She leads CCI's cultural competence consulting portfolio and provides a range of leadership development, strategy development, and change management consulting and training services within both public and private sector organizations and academic institutions. Kath will do her presentation, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. I'm now going to pass the mic to Kathy to get us started.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. I'm so delighted to be here today. I have been very excited and honored to be part of this museum inclusivity project since we started trying to get funding a few years ago. So we have already started a project in Peel Region in Ontario, which is going to wrap up at the end of this year, and then we got the funding for the Ontario-wide project, which was extremely exciting. For myself personally, I am a huge fan of museums. When me and my family travel, that is what we do. We go to museums. So last year we went to Ireland and France, and we visited 12 museums in 2 weeks. So that can tell you my dedication to museums. So I'm very excited and delighted to be part of this project here, which really connects to the things that I'm most passionate about. We're going to talk a little bit about what cultural competence is and some ways of approaching it, and also how people actually develop in cultural competence along the developmental continuum. If you are on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle right there, @CatGL. I have a ridiculously long last name, but a short Twitter handle. And we also have the CCDI's Twitter handle there, and the hashtag CDN Diversity. So if you're looking for information on diversity in Canada, that's a good hashtag to follow. Because there's new news being shared daily there, specifically to Canada around diversity. So moving on to the agenda, we'll talk first about the imperative, why it's important to develop cultural competence. The most obvious one is the changing demographics of Ontario, but there's a lot of other reasons why it's really important and effective for our organizations, for ourselves personally. Some definition of terms so that we know what we're talking about. Then we'll talk a little bit about dimensions of culture, then the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I'm going to touch briefly on how you actually measure it, but I wanted to provide more time for questions functions, and so I didn't include a lot of slides specifically around measurement. If you're interested in that, certainly feel free to reach out to me and I'll provide more information. We have a whole presentation on that. And then some tips for developing cultural competence. Now, I have to give a bit of a caveat before we get started. This is going to be a very high-level introduction to a very deep topic. When I first started teaching about this 12 years ago, when I was working for Hewitt Associates, a global human resources consulting firm, our introductory cross-cultural training was 4.5 hours. So in a 90-minute webinar, we can't really go that deep. I can provide you with some information and some of the overview of some of the key terms and theories, some of the ways that you can start to develop this more yourself as you move forward. But certainly this is just a high-level introduction, so I wanted to make that clear before we move forward. The imperative. First of all, there's been some great research that talks about the importance of actually developing culturally competent leaders in organizations. And so there's a number of research reports that we've cited here. One shows that you have improved recruitment of diverse employees when you have culturally competent leaders. And I'm talking specifically here about research that refers to culturally competent leaders, not just inclusive leaders. There's a lot of research that talks about inclusive leadership. These ones are specific to cultural competence. Improved team functionality has been found in many research reports around cultural competence, as well as increased employee retention. There's been a couple of research reports that have found specifically that you increase employee retention when your leaders are culturally competent. We all know that in organizations that having an inclusive organization improves employee engagement. And so there's been some really great research that's been done by Deloitte that talks about specifically focusing on both diversity and inclusion and the uplift to employee engagement. And we know how important employee engagement is. When you have engaged employees, you have reduced turnover, you have reduced absenteeism, you have better customer service, you have a better ability to connect with your communities, and you have a more enjoyable work environment. You have people who are engaged, who are willing to go above and beyond and speak positively about your workplace. In fact, Aon did some research in 2010 that showed that every disengaged employee costs your organization $10,000 per year. So engagement's really important. Now, what White has done here is actually quantify that when you focus on just diversity, so high commitment to diversity, but not feeling included, then there's a slight uplift to employee engagement, 20%. When you focus on just inclusion, but not focus on the diversity in the organization, you get an uplift of 67% to your employee engagement. But when you actually get the correct, and you're focusing on both high diversity and high inclusion, then you can actually double the engagement of those employees who are listed as disengaged. So that's really, really important when we look at so many organizations measuring employee engagement, and what they often find is they're doing a bunch of things to improve employee engagement, and then they stagnate or they plateau. They get to a point where they can't move forward any further, and that's partly because they're not paying attention to these things. So having a strong commitment to diversity and inclusion is important, and it's important to get that mix right. Some other reasons why we really should be paying attention to developing cultural competence. There's been research that finds that multicultural teams are not necessarily more effective than monocultural teams, and the difference in how the leader manages the team. So if the leader of the team is ignoring or suppressing cultural differences, those differences can become an obstacle to the team performing well. This aligns well with some of the research I just cited about the improved team functionality that's found when you have culturally competent leaders. Peace talks about how when the leaders are actually acknowledging and supporting cultural differences, then those differences become an asset to performance. And this is something that has played out in research time and time again. When we know that we have diverse teams, even if we can't see the diversity in the team, we have people of different ages, people of different genders, people of different people who may identify as LGBT, we have people with disabilities. Even if we don't have actual visible ethnic diversity in the team or people with visible disabilities, we have lots of diversity, lots of different cultures in most of our teams. So it's really important that we be more cognizant of making sure that we're acknowledging the different perspectives that people bring to the table, and that actually helps the team perform better. Here's an interesting one. You might be wondering why you're looking at an airplane right now. Boeing actually has a number of really great stories that they share internally in their internal newsletters. We wish they would share them externally, but they actually leverage cultural diversity for the purpose of innovation. And what they did here is when they were developing the 787 Dreamliner plane, it was shortly after the merger of 4 aviation companies that had come together to form the new Boeing. And you know there are different corporate cultures. There are different ways of doing things in different organizations. They deliberately brought together a team of designers for this wing. So if you look at the wing on this plane, it is a little bit different than you might be used to seeing on other planes. So they brought together a team of designers who were from the 4 legacy companies, and they also ensured that they had age, ethnic, and gender diversity on the team, specifically intended to leverage the diverse perspectives that people bring in of developing the new wing. And they told the team, let's think outside of the box, like throw away everything that you've thought about in terms of how you design a wing, and let's think about this differently. And so they came up with an innovative wing design, and they also say that they did it faster than any other wing design project in the history of aviation and under budget. They might be exaggerating slightly there, but the point is they really did deliberately leverage that diversity in the team for the sake of innovation. And they have numerous stories that they share internally within their organization about this. So that's a great sort of story about how bringing and leveraging those diverse perspectives in the team really contribute to innovation in an organization. There's another story about how the lack of diverse perspectives can cause some serious PR problems, and that happened with Apple last year when the news broke about the particular problem with Siri. So if you have an Apple iPhone, probably are familiar with Siri, the voice recognition software there that you can speak to. So apparently, if you had Siri and you clicked Siri and said, Siri, I just had a heart attack, Siri would say, oh, let me call, here's 3 local hospitals. Do you want me to call an ambulance for you? However, if you said, Siri, I just got raped, Siri would say, I don't understand. Because people who designed Siri and programmed Siri for all the possible combination of events that could happen to somebody didn't take into account that somebody might say to it, I just got raped. So there's one example of why you really need diverse teams participating in your development of whatever it is that you're going to put out to the public, to make sure that different perspectives are taken into account, different experiences are taken into account, so that you don't leave anything behind or miss or have a PR crisis like that. Some other reasons why we really need to develop cultural competence. We have an incredibly quickly changing labor force in Canada. This graph is not upside down. It is actually showing the projections of labor force supply that are going to happen in the next 20 years or so here in Canada. So what's happening is these are population projections based on different scenarios on population growth. So the fuchsia bar is based on if we have high population growth. The red bar is based on if we have medium population growth, and the light pink bar is based on if we were to have low population growth. Well, I can tell you the facts have borne out that we do not have high population growth in Canada. In 2014, we reached a negative natural increase, meaning more people are dying than being born. This is the first time this has ever happened in Canadian history. So all population growth is now coming from immigration. This particular set of research by Rick Miner and his associates looks at labor force projections in Canada over the next several decades. And what he's showing here is that there's actually going to be a dramatic shortage of labor in Canada based on the participation of the groups that are participating in the labor force right now. And as you can see, there's so many people about to retire from and leaving and there's a growth of requirements in our labor force that we're actually going to be experiencing some serious shortages. So by 2031, the projection here is that there's going to be between 1.5 million and 4 million open jobs unfilled. So that's a labor force shortage. Those numbers down the left-hand side of the bar are actually showing numbers in the thousands. So that 1,500 is actually 1.5 million. So there are some serious labor force shortages. Ways that are being projected for Canada. The way that Rick Miner and his associates have actually suggested to respond to this is to ensure, one, that there's better participation of the underserved, under-participating groups in the Canadian labor force. Those are Indigenous people, people with disabilities, youth, visible minorities, women, and newcomers. So we need to ensure that they're better able to participate and contribute their talents to our labor force because we desperately need them. Now, there's another impending issue that's coming up in Canada as well, and that is the dependency ratio. This is entirely based on age demographics, and the dependency ratio is the ratio of people who are between 15 and 65 compared to those who are under 15 and over 65. So essentially, it's the ratio of people who are technically at the age where they're able to work versus those who are technically at the age where they're not able to work. So those people who are not able to work below 15 and above 65 are considered the dependents. You can see here that the light blue bar is 2010 and the dark blue bar is the projection for 2036. So what you see here is in 2010, Canada had a dependency ratio of 44%. That's sustainable. You can, ensure that you have enough people contributing to the economy to sustain that kind of a dependency ratio. This does not take into account labor force participation or unemployment at all. It's simply age. So you can see then that the projection for 2036 is 65% dependency ratio, meaning 2 dependents for every 1 working person. That is simply not financially sustainable. And you can see also Ontario has a similar situation to Canada. Ontario's projection is 64% for 2036. Some of the Atlantic provinces have a much bigger problem coming. The only way to mitigate this situation is by bringing more immigrants into our labor force. That is it. That's the only way. So as we can see that the demographics of Canada are changing through immigration and through migration internally within Canada, even those of you who are dialed in from different areas around Ontario, most of the growth in different areas around Ontario, Simcoe region, northern regions, eastern regions, almost all of it is coming from intra-provincial migration, meaning people moving from the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area into other areas of the province, which we know that the entire province is becoming more ethnically and culturally diverse as we move forward. We also know that we have a requirement to bring more people in, newcomers to our economy, to ensure that we don't experience this financial collapse that's impending if we don't do something about it. So that's part of the reason why you'll see that we have some very strong goals in terms of bringing in more newcomers into the Canadian economy, because those people who are setting those goals in Immigration Canada recognize this impending scenario that we're trying to avoid. So there's a great deal of impetus and imperative for us to develop cultural competence. The next thing I want to talk about is helping you understand yourselves as cultural beings. And this is an important piece of developing cultural competence, as we'll see in a few minutes. But I want to do this little activity first. I know it's a bit odd to do this kind of activity on a webinar, but rather than have me talk at you for 70 minutes, we wanted to get you engaged a little bit as well. So I like quotes. This one is, why do we need to understand ourselves? As you'll see, Anais Nin has a very good way of saying this. We see the world through the lens of our own worldview, the way we see the world. The way we see things actually changes what we see. So it's important that we understand ourselves and those things that are impacting us. So I'd like you all to take out a piece of paper for a moment, or if you're on a computer, you can open up a Word document and type this. What I'd like you to do is answer as many of these questions about yourself as possible. I'm going to play some music for a few minutes just while you're doing that, and then we'll come back and I'm going to ask you some questions to consider, and then we're going to attempt to open up the phone lines and have a brief conversation about this. I know there's a lot of you on the phone, but anyone who wants to share their insights, we'll welcome you to do that, and then we'll all be able to revisit this at the end when we do the question and answer session. So right here, here's a whole bunch of things for you to consider. If you could just take a moment, please, and answer as many of these questions about yourself as possible. What is your gender? What's your sexual orientation? What's your gender identity? What's your religion, your nationality? All of these things. Just start writing them down yourself, and then we'll come back in a moment and we will give you some things to think about from this point of view and also have a bit of a discussion. So I'll give you a few minutes to complete that, okay? Thanks. sure some of you have already finished answering all these questions or writing down the way you identify yourself. Some of you might still be finishing. So we're finishing. I just wanted to throw out a couple of things to think about. One is there's a associated with each one of these things that you just wrote down. There's a set of assumptions and norms in the way that you see the world that's associated with each of these ways that you could possibly identify yourself. One of my colleagues did some really interesting work around the culture of poverty. So depending on, where you were raised in terms of what kind of socioeconomic status you had, it really changes the way you see the world, the set of expectations you have about the way you manage your life and what's possible for you. So each one of these things has a culture associated with it. And so what we're trying to do is get people to understand culture much more broadly than just national culture or ethnic culture, that there really are a lot of impacts to our cultural identity. So most of you have probably finished answering these questions. I'm going to move forward to the next slide, and I'm going to give you some things to think about now. So the things to think about. First, I'd like you to identify one dimension, just one, of all those things that you just wrote down that you think most defines who you are. So think that for a moment. I want you to consider how this impacts your view, the way you see the world, the set of expectations and assumptions that you have about the world, the set of expectations and assumptions that you have of how you view and interact with other people. Okay, now we're going to open it up a little bit, and Rhiannon, I'm going to ask you to unmute the lines if we can, and if anybody would be interested in sharing their thoughts about this. And I'm going to bring up one more question for you to consider now. Is it hard for you to choose just one thing that most defines who you are? Anybody like to share your thoughts around your experience of answering those questions for yourself, whether or not it was difficult to choose just one, and what you think the impact is on the one thing that you chose?
The line should be, those who have recording devices, you are now unmuted, so you should be able to speak.
I'm Donna from the Robert McLaughlin Gallery.
Hi.
I think one of the difficulties I'm having right now is the select one dimension without being able to reference that pretty significant list.
Oh, I'll go back there.
That might be helpful.
There you go.
And just predicting that it's going to be really hard. It's going to take a lot of thought to identify, like, with just one of these.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. I've seen a couple of people providing information through chat also saying it was very hard to choose just one.
Lucas here, also from Robert McLaughlin Gallery.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
I hear you.
I was, like Donna and I guess a lot of people are saying, having a hard time picking just one, only because there's so many things that influence. So, as someone who identifies as gay, that takes up a lot of my space. But as someone who's much younger than my members on staff here, my perspectives are also different, right? But then also within this of being a gay man, the perspective of a young gay man who didn't go through the hardships that older gay men would have gone through is also aspect of that as well, right? So I don't know if there's even is a possibility of just picking one, because I think they're all somewhat touching.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Comment coming in from Jacqueline here. The challenge is deciding which dimension. We have a lot more nuanced view of ourselves, I think, and so we tend not to see ourselves in terms of dimensions. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a few more comments there on the chair from all participants.
Go ahead, Rhiannon.
So we've got Kara Kapatic. So we have a comment here. The most influential cultural characteristics for me wasn't even represented in the list of questions, just how long it might take to learn about all those pivotal identities, moments in others' lives.
Absolutely. I work with, I did this activity with a group of people who are educators, and one of the women in the group said the thing that most defined her was the fact that she was the first person in her family who went to university. So again, there are many, many things that we may think have a strong impact on our definition of ourselves.
Yeah, I've got a couple more comments here. Jess, still at OCAD, was just saying, personally being conditioned to never choose just one. That's one of the challenges. We've also got a comment here from Karen Taylor that says, I think it depends what context I'm in, which has the most impact. And we have another comment here from Pauline. This is, I think, that also depends on what I'm focused on at any given time. So again, my sense of identity changes from work to home.
Thank everyone for sharing that. That's really great. Anybody else want to speak out loud to share their thoughts on this exercise before we move forward? Thank you very much, Rhiannon. I'm going to ask you to mute the lines again because there's a bit of a noise.
Certainly.
So,
yeah, give me 1 second.
Excellent.
So are we good?
Thank you much. Excellent. And so a number of people have just made some more comments about different ways of identifying at home versus work in different settings. Identifying as an introvert, it all has a great deal of impact on the way we identify ourselves. And so part of the purpose of this exercise is really to point out that it is very, very difficult to choose just one. But the thing that we need to take away from this exercise is that often we judge other people based on one thing that we can see about them, whether that's their ethnicity, whether that's their socioeconomic status based on their clothes, whether that's their gender, whether that's their religion, if they are wearing something that identifies their religion. So, part of the purpose of this exercise is to help us identify the depth of our own cultural identities and recognize that we really need to be very careful about not judging people based on the 1 or 2 or 3 things that we can immediately see about them. Because in many cases, the way that we define ourselves most strongly is actually not visible to others. And we have this range of things that can impact our identities. And as many of you pointed out, what you identify with most can change from one situation to the next. So we really need to recognize we have this complexity to our cultural identity, and that each of the people that we're interacting with do as well. So we need to take that into account when we're approaching people, understanding that they have the same depth of complexity that we have. Moving on a little bit to talk about what is cultural competence and how do we define that. So individual cultural competence is defined as the ability to discern and take into account your own cultural identity, your own worldview, and others' worldviews to be able to communicate more effectively, solve problems, make decisions, and resolve conflicts in ways that optimize cultural differences for better, longer-lasting, and more creative solutions. And the point here is the optimizing the cultural differences as opposed to polarizing them, which, as we'll see in a little while, that is something that some people do depending on their level of development. That's about individuals. Now, when you're talking about developing individual cultural competence, there are 4 main components. So awareness of your own cultural worldview. So that's why we do this little exercise where we help you identify the various components of your cultural identity. Understanding what your worldview is and defining it and your values. All of that is an important part of developing cultural competence so that you can start to see how you may be similar to or differ from others. Then the next piece is your attitude toward cultural differences. And what we're seeking here is an open, respectful, accepting, and seek to understand attitude toward differences as opposed to a polarizing or rejecting attitude. Knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. So that's beginning to develop an understanding of the way different cultures may have different norms of behaviors and expectations and worldviews that can play out quite dramatically in intercultural communications and interactions that we have with other people. And certainly there's no expectation that you're going to learn about every culture on earth. That's just impossible. What we hope that you'll start to be more curious about is learning about what are some of the nuances in the different cultural communities that you're dealing with wherever your museum happens to be located. Building cross-cultural skills. And that is an area that has developed over the last 40 years where it's become recognized that cross-cultural skills are something that people can develop. Back 40, 50, 60 years ago, cultural competence was considered to be a personality trait. You either had it or you didn't. So State Departments and international aid agencies and those types of organizations would have a questionnaire that would determine whether or not you had the trait of cultural competence. And if you didn't have it, they said, okay, you're not going to be hired here. people working in this field over the last 40 years have recognized that people can develop their skill and their understanding and their ability to communicate and to interact cross-culturally. So this is where this whole area of cross-cultural competence development has emerged, because we recognize it is something that people can learn about and develop, as opposed to just a trait that you either have or you don't. So this is an important piece to understand as we're moving forward, that it is something that that you can develop, but it takes actual deliberate, friction on what you're learning about cultural differences and what you're learning about yourself as well. So if you're looking at an organization, how do you develop cultural competence in an organization? There are 5 essential elements, and the first seems kind of obvious, but that's valuing diversity. We have some organizations that we've encountered here at CCDI that really don't value diversity, that they try to suppress diversity, and that actually causes a lot of problems for them. So having a value for diversity in your organization is the first step. Having the capacity for cultural self-assessment is an important one, and there are different tools that organizations can use to help people learn about their understanding of cultural difference, and then be conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact. So whatever cultures it is that you're interacting with most frequently, wherever your context is, you need to be very aware of the dynamics that can happen when these cultures interact, so that you can help people work through those. Institutionalized cultural knowledge about the cultures that you're dealing with is important as well. So, doing that scan of the area, the community that you're serving, and understanding what are the major cultures there, and how do their worldviews and their approaches and their values differ from yours personally or from the people who lead your museum, so that you can, respond to your communities more effectively. And then developing adaptations to service delivery reflecting an understanding of cultural diversity. This is one of the hardest things for organizations to do, but it is one of the most effective. And you'll see a lot of organizations are really getting very good at responding to their immediate communities in ways that are culturally appropriate for those communities. Not what we think that they want, but by, consulting with them about what they want and doing it in an appropriate and understanding and respectful way. One thing you might be familiar with is the iceberg model of culture. There's an iceberg model of everything, but the whole idea here is that most people's view of culture is the surface culture. It's those things that you can see on the surface, the trappings of culture. But underneath the waterline, there's much deeper aspect of our culture that is unseen by most people. So this is part of our learning, is that we really need to understand the depth of all the different ways that our culture, our worldview, all the many ways that we identify have impacted the way we have these orientations to respect and power, social status, emotions, how much we feel it's okay to show emotion, parenting, cleanliness, gender roles. There's just a whole bunch of them. I'll let you read through that whole list there for a moment. So you see that our cultural identity and our worldview really has a huge impact on a lot of things that impact the way we're going to communicate with other people. And when we don't approach people with an understanding of some of these differences, we can get into some misunderstandings and miscommunications based on the assumptions and expectations that we bring. This next section, I'm going to talk about dimensions of culture, which really impacts some of those assumptions that people bring into any kind of encounter based on their cultural worldview. So the cultural worldview, I should have covered this earlier, is ingrained in us by the time we are 5 years old, and it's mostly unquestioned and unconscious. So this is the list of shoulds, your list of rules about how you're supposed to behave in society. And we get this list of rules mainly from our parents, and it's not because our parents said, well, we do this because we're this culture and other cultures do that. No, it's more about the ways that you were punished and rewarded for different kinds of behaviors. So you internalize those different kinds of behaviors as the right way to behave and the wrong way to behave. And that's our cultural worldview. That's our list of shoulds, our list of rules on how you behave. Those create our assumptions and expectations about behavior from other people. And so there's been some great research that's been done that actually shows that different cultures around the world have very different lists of shoulds. And so I'm going to cover this right now. But first, before we get into what are those different dimensions, we want to talk about idealizations, archetypes versus stereotypes. So when we look at this dimension, I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is individualism versus communitarianism. Individualism is seeing the world through the view of how does this affect me. Communitarianism is seeing the world through the view of how does this affect my community, my group, my family. Now, when we research in different countries, we see that some countries tend to lean toward one side or the other of the dichotomy. So we know that in the U.S., people tend to be more individualistic. In Japan, people tend to be more communitarian, and this is based on research done by Dr. Milton Bennett. Now, then what we find is that there's lots of people who don't align with that majority. And we know people, in our own circle who know what the rules of society are, or sort of the expected modes of behavior, but reject them altogether. We also know people who just, because of their personality or the many, many impacts on their cultural identity, don't necessarily align with the archetype for their particular group. So here's a great example. So in Japan, we know that the majority of people tend to be communitarian. However, you have a whole lot of people right in the middle of that dichotomy, and you have a number of people who, in statistical terms, are called outliers, who are more on the individualistic side. And similarly, you have a lot of people who tend to be more individualistic. You have a whole bunch of people in the middle who don't really lean toward one side or the other. And then you have also the outliers who are more communitarian. So it's important to recognize that there are these archetypes by country, that certain countries tend to lead more toward one side of the dichotomy or the other. But when you assume that each person you meet from that country aligns with the archetype, that is stereotyping them. So it's important to recognize that we are each individuals who have this very complex set of identities that have molded us and impacted our worldview. So we may or may not align with these different approaches, but it's important for us to understand where we align with these approaches and to understand that when we're encountering somebody else, they may have a very different approach. So that's part of the reason why we talk about these different dimensions of culture. So what are the dimensions of culture? This is based on work by Fons Trompenaar and Charles Hampton Turner. And at the end, I'm going to show you a book written by them if you want to delve more deeply into this, about how they got here and what these things mean in quite a lot more depth. There are some other theorists as well who've come up with different dimensions of culture, but there is a lot of overlap between many of these different dimensions. Some of them have 7 dimensions, some of them have 6, some of them have 5. Fons Trompenaar and Charles Hampton Turner here have presented 7. So the first dimension is, as we already talked about a little bit, individualism versus communitarianism. So that's the idea of how we see ourselves in relation to others. And on the individualistic side, people believe in personal freedom and achievement. They view the world through the lens of how does this affect me? The what's in it for me argument, right? And that you make your own decisions and you have to take care of yourself. On the communitarian side of things, people believe that the group is more important than the individual, and the group provides help and safety in exchange for loyalty. The group always comes before the individual in a highly communitarian society. Now, as we talk about each of these dichotomies, you'll probably note that you're going to land more on one side or the other of these various dichotomies. You'll probably note that Canadian society is more on one side or the other, and that some other countries are on other sides. But we also know that that the people, when you encounter somebody who's on the other side of the dimension, it brings out a lot of judgment, right? So the individualists feel like people from communitarian societies are allowing themselves to be controlled by their society, their group, right? People from communitarian societies believe that individualistic people are very selfish. So it's quite common for strong judgments to come out when you're encountering someone who has a very different orientation. This is part of why it's important for us to understand that we have these different types of orientations, and that the people we're encountering may have a very different orientation. And when you start to realize this, we need to really, give the benefit of the doubt and start to unpack how we're going to interact with this person in a way that's going to be mutually beneficial for all. So the next is called universalism versus particularism, easy for me to say. Universalism, this is about how we define what's fair and how we assign rules or how we apply rules. So on the universalistic side, people place a high importance on laws, rules, values, and obligations. They deal fairly and objectively with all people based on the rules, and the rules come before the relationships. In the particularism side, people believe that each circumstance and each relationship dictates the rules they live by, so that the rules are applied in context. And their response to a situation may change depending on what's happening or who's involved. So again, people become very judgmental of each other. The universalists think that the particularists are just picking and choosing the rules. The particularists are saying that the universalists are too cold and not taking into account the gray areas and the ambiguity of life. So again, there's a lot of judgments that come out on either side. Task versus relationship. This talks about how we work together and how we get things done. It's also sometimes called specific and diffuse. So where the task side is called specific and the relationship side is called diffuse. It really depends on which theorist you're talking about. So on the task side, people keep work and personal life separately. They believe that the relationships don't have that much impact on work objectives, and they're more inclined to get down to work and believe that the relationship will develop as people work together. On the relationship side, people see a great overlap between work and personal life, and they believe that good relationships are absolutely vital to meeting business objectives, and that their relationships with other people will be the same regardless of whether they're at work or meeting socially. And in these kind of societies, people often will spend a lot of time outside of work with colleagues, and there's a lot more melding between the different spheres of life. If you're old enough to remember the Seinfeld episode where George is running around going, "Worlds are colliding, worlds are colliding," that's a clear indication that he's on the task side, because he was getting upset that his work life, his friends, and his family worlds, which he liked to keep separate, were all colliding with each other. This is a very strong difference between people, and people who are very task-oriented really don't enjoy having these different realms of their life colliding and interacting, and like to keep things quite separate. You can kind of see indications of this from people when you're looking at people's cubicles or workspaces at work. The people who have a lot of picture and personal stuff on their desks tend to be more relationship oriented or leaning toward that. People who have just business stuff around them at work tend to be more task oriented and keep things a little bit more separate. So that's just one small indication. It's not necessarily the only indication, but it's one thing to keep in mind as you're looking at people that might be a clue to their orientation here. Next one is around achievement versus ascription, and this is around how we view status and hierarchy. And I apologize very much for the sirens in the background. I'm in an old building at Yonge and College in downtown Toronto, and I'm looking at Toronto Police Headquarters, so we often get a lot of noise here. Achievement versus ascription, status and hierarchy. Different societies really place a strong importance on a hierarchy, and some don't place as much importance on hierarchy. So the achievement side, here it's more about what you do, what you personally have achieved, and that these kind of cultures really value personal performance, and it's not so much important who your father was or what your status in society was. In the ascription side of things, there's a lot more focus placed on people's status in society, that there's certain ways that you're supposed to respond to people of higher status. There's certain ways of talking to them. It's actually built into some languages in terms of, having a formal way of saying you. In French, for example, you have tu and vous. One is informal, one is formal, so that the built-in recognition of status is part of how you actually communicate with people. On the ascription side, people believe that you should be valued for part of your title or your where you fall in society, and there's very, very strict protocols in some societies about how you are supposed to address and respond to people who have higher status. And in some societies, there's even rules about how much eye contact you're allowed to make with people of higher status, and this is something that plays out quite a lot in job interviews, for example, in North America. In neutral versus effective, the next stage is how we manage emotions, or how much emotions is okay to show in public, in society. So in the neutral side, people make a great effort to control their emotions, and reason influences their actions far more than their feelings, and they often don't reveal what they're thinking or how they're feeling. On the emotional side, people want to find ways to express their emotions, even spontaneously, even quite strongly, and often at work. And these cultures, it's welcome and accepted to show emotion, and you can see how very strong judgments might come out when you have people on different sides of this dichotomy. The people who are more effective or emotional believe that the people who are neutral are being dishonest because they're not showing how they really feel or saying how they really feel in communications. The people on the neutral side feel like the emotional or affective people are out of control, unprofessional, etc. So there's a lot of judgments that come out depending on what you've been raised with and how much emotion it's okay for you to show in the society or in the set of rules in which you've been raised. Sequential time versus synchronous time plays out quite a lot in North American workplaces as well. So in sequential time, that's where time is very important. Things are supposed to happen in order. People place a high value on punctuality and on planning and sticking to plans and staying on schedule. The phrases "time is money" is associated with this type of approach, and it really throws people off, or they actually consider it to be quite disrespectful when timing is off, or when agendas are off, or when people are late. My mother is one of those people who considers it extremely disrespectful if you're late. I was born 2 weeks late, so we started off on the wrong foot right there. The synchronous time cultures tend to see the past, present, and future as interwoven and cyclical, and they may work on several projects at once, and they may view exact times and commitments as flexible. And so when everybody in society kind of feels this way, it's not such a big deal when someone is late. Things happen when they're supposed to. Things get finished when they're supposed to. It's not such a big deal. And people get very, very judgmental of each other. The people on the synchronous time side think the sequential time people are very rigid. The people on the sequential time side think the synchronous time people are, again, out of control and not very structured. So there's a lot of judgment that comes out depending on which side you're on. And the final one here, called internal control versus external control, talks about how we manage our environment or how much control we feel we have over our environment. On the internal control side, people believe that they have a great deal of control over their environment, and this includes how they work with teams and within organizations. And so you find things like people will say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be the master of your own destiny. Those are phrases that really reflect that kind of approach. On the external control side, people have more of a sense that nature, the environment, other things may control you, that there are other things that may happen that are going to be out of your control. So they focus their actions on other people more than on things, and they might need reassurance that they're doing a good job because of a recognition that there's all these other things that are out of their control that they're trying to manage as best they can within the sphere of control that they have. Some phrases that really reflect this kind of perspective is inshallah, God willing, and que sera, sera. So, the idea of inshallah is, I'll meet you for lunch tomorrow, inshallah, God willing. Something might happen between now and lunch tomorrow which might prevent me from being there. So that's built through, that kind of worldview is built into the language, the way people talk. The judgments come out. So the internal control people will say that the external control people are, not taking responsibility. They're blaming others for their problems. The external control people think that the internal control people are not taking into account reality, that there are going to be things that happen. So again, there's a lot of judgments that come out when you identify with one side or the other of these different dichotomies. I've just covered this quite in-depth theory in a few minutes, and so if you really want to learn more about it, there's a book that I'm going to mention at the end called Riding the Waves of Culture, which delves quite deeply into how Fons Trumpenaar and Charles Hampson Turner came up with these different dimensions, and delving more deeply into how they play out in society and in your communications and in organizations. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to actually develop in our understanding of cultural competence. And we know it's often very difficult to talk about culture and race with people. This is one of the things that's most difficult for people to talk about. It's often creates great disharmony and polarizing, and it's quite difficult. And part of the reason is because people are at different developmental levels in their understanding of cultural difference. Okay, so we're going to talk about this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, the DMIS, which shows how people actually develop in the understanding of the complexity of cultural differences. So the first three stages, denial, polarization, and minimization, are referred to as ethnocentric or monocultural mindsets. And that means that you're seeing the world through the lens that your worldview is primary. Okay? Then when you look at the top three stages here, acceptance, adaptation, and integration, those are considered to be ethno-relative or intercultural mindsets. And here the idea is that you're seeing the world through the lens that your worldview is simply one of many potential worldviews. And your goal then is to understand those other worldviews, those other ways of seeing the world, those other list of shoulds your expectations and assumptions, to learn how you can better adapt and communicate with people from those who have those different worldviews. So essentially the whole purpose here is to make you a better communicator and to make you more self-aware. So the different stages here, in the first three stages, development through these stages is overcoming ethnocentrism. So in the stage called denial, here people have a strong disinterest or avoidance of cultural differences. They do not really construe the world in cultural ways. People who are in this stage of development tend to be in pretty homogenous areas, either by choice or by chance, and they're not going to have much experience or exposure to people who have different cultural worldviews than they have. And so if they have any conception of cultural difference, it's going to be really, really broad brushstrokes like us and foreigners. The next stage is called polarization. And as the name suggests, people are polarizing differences. So this can play out in a couple of different ways. One is called defense, and that is where a person believes my culture is superior to pretty much any other cultures that they're comparing to. The other way it can show is what we call reversal, and that's where the person has created this negative view of their own culture in relation to other cultures. This can play out in a number of different ways. It can be where somebody who is a minoritized individual in their society internalizes the negative messages about their own group that are perpetrated by the society in which they live. Many of you might be familiar with the phrase colonization of the mind. So this reversal is essentially internalized colonization or internalized racism or internalized sexism or whatever it is that you're internalizing that gives you a negative view of your own group in comparison to other groups. The problem of polarization, of course, is that assignment of good or bad, of judgment to cultures. Cultures exist. We are born into them by accident of birth. We learn the rules of our culture by the time we're 5 years old, and they're mostly internalized, unquestioned, and unconscious. So judging other cultures as bad and judging the people from those cultures as bad is part of the problem of polarization, which makes it very difficult to be able to actually engage with people authentically and be able to communicate with them if judging their entire culture as bad. This is where typically racist behavior comes from, or racist mindsets come from. And so it's really important that we're moving people forward out of this stage of development into what is called minimization. And I would point out that we cannot skip stages. We have to go from polarization into minimization, into acceptance. And a lot of the cross-cultural training that we do is intended to help people move forward one stage at a time. The people that do the measurements of where people fall on this spectrum have actually found that it takes 40 to 60 hours of targeted, deliberate cross-cultural development in order to move one full stage. So it's really important that this be considered sort of a lifelong learning journey, and that there be a targeted, deliberate effort to help people understand themselves as a cultural being and the things that they're learning about cultural differences as they move forward. When we look at minimization, this is the overemphasis of similarity. It's this idea that people are basically all the same, the idea that people basically have the same worldview as I do, and their list of shoulds are the same as mine. You'll hear the phrase common sense bandied about quite a lot. When we think about common sense, it's really cultural and context specific. I live in the city of Toronto, as you can probably hear. Apologize for the background noise. When I get out of my car at a shopping mall, I lock the door. It's automatic. My mother and my sister live in a small town in northern Ontario, and if you get out of the car and lock your door at the store there, people will look at you like, what is wrong with you? Because it's not common sense to lock your door there. It's common sense to leave your door open. In fact, some people leave their keys in the ignition with the window down. My mother's neighbor sold her house, so when it came time to hand over the keys, she didn't know where they were because she hadn't locked her front door in 30 years. So, common sense is really cultural and contextual. And the problem with minimization is that people assume similarity. So the assumption of similarity means that we're often going to be judgmental when we encounter people who have different worldviews than us. So when we encounter those different dimensions of culture, if we assume people are pretty much the same, we'll become judgmental. Some of the phrases that come out of minimization, you'll hear people say things like, I don't even see color. right? I'm colorblind. That's total minimization. It's minimizing the importance of the differences that people bring. If you think about some of the major rules in our major religions, so in Christianity, there's the golden rule, which is you do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. This same rule exists in the 13 major religions of the world. So in Confucianism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam, in Judaism, in Sikhism, in many of these different religions, there's a very similar rule about how you have to behave to others. It's very much a minimization rule because it assumes that other people want done to them what you want done to you. So the interculturalists have reframed this now, the platinum rule, and it is do unto others as they want done unto themselves. But the challenge is you need to figure out what it is that they want. So moving up into ethno-relativism, the next stage is called acceptance, and that's where people have a strong respect for the differences and the value differences, the behavioral differences and the value differences that people bring because of the cultures that they were raised in. Now, acceptance doesn't mean that you have to approve of or agree with everything that every culture does. It means that you accept and respect that people have been raised in a different cultural context than you. You are not expected to give up your own values or your own culture in order to become culturally competent. Quite the opposite. You really need to understand yourself and your values and your culture in order to become culturally competent so that you can understand when people are similar to you and when people are different from you and how you have to adapt. Okay? But adaptation does not mean selling out or changing who you are. It means adapting your behavior in different cultural contexts. So adapting perspective and adapting behavior are we do all the time. When we watch a movie and we feel pathos for the main character and we start to feel the emotions that that main character is feeling, that's adapting your perspective. You're taking someone else's perspective. In terms of adapting behavior, this is something that we do all the time. When we speak differently to a young child than we do to our coworker, we might speak differently to our spouse than we do to our boss, than we do to our best friend when we're out for the evening. We adapt our behavior in different contexts because it's appropriate. We do this all the time. So this is just taking that same thing that we do, the same skill that we already have in adapting, and applying it to cultural contexts. So the challenge here is you need to learn what are the nuances of the culture that you're trying to adapt to. And that's all about building your knowledge and understanding of different cultural practices and norms and values and what's appropriate in different contexts and what's not so that you can learn how to adapt. It's not about selling out or changing who you are as a person. It's just about becoming a more effective communicator in different contexts. The final stage is called integration. And here, this is an incredibly rare stage to be at. People here have integrated worldviews. And so what happens here is, again, as I mentioned, it's incredibly rare. Often in the past, it's been people who have, who themselves are bicultural or biracial. They have parents from different cultures, different races, and so they've been exposed to different cultures from a very young age. The other way this comes about sometimes is if a person has moved from one culture to another during their formative years, and they've been exposed to these different cultural worldviews, and so they've actually created their own hybrid worldview. And so what happens here is these people tend to be really good at mediating, conversations and discussions between others because they're very good at seeing different points of view and helping people see each other's points of view. Now, I was going to do a whole section on how we measure this in the tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory, but I wanted to provide some more time to talk about how we develop and then give some time for questions. So there's a tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory, and if I can just go back for a moment to the beginning here. So the Intercultural Development Inventory measures where people are on this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And here's the interesting thing. What we find, hundreds of thousands of people around the world have been measured. And what we find is that 70% of people are in minimization. So when you think about that from our societal point of view, from our organizational point of view, most times when we're doing cross-cultural training or development, we're trying to move people from minimization to acceptance. We generally find about 13 to 15% of the population in polarization, and about 13 to 15% of the population is in acceptance, and then a very, very small percentage in denial and adaptation. I do a lot of assessments with leadership teams, and across the board, across Canada, when I'm doing leadership team of an organization, I generally find 65 to 75% of the leadership team is in minimization. When we have some leaders in polarization, we have a really different type of development that we're working on with them, because we need to move people from polarization into minimization before they can move on to acceptance. So it's kind of something that's interesting to take into account, and part of the reason why it's so challenging to talk to people about race and difference and cultural difference in Canada is when you think about the fact that most people are in minimization from their own developmental perspective. They're minimizing the importance of difference. So part of what we need to do is help them understand the importance of difference and help them move forward into acceptance. And that's part of why, a lot of people who are doing work around diversity and inclusion will frame the messages that we're sending in a way that's going to be acceptable to people in minimization to help them move forward, okay? So that's something to think about as we're measuring. And if you'd like to learn more about the IDI and the measurement tool, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I can provide tons of information about that. It is a really fantastic tool. I've been using it for 12 years and have assessed hundreds of people, and so it's really quite remarkable, the depth of understanding you get about yourself, and then provide you with a whole developmental plan on how you actually develop into the next stage. So just jumping back to where we were in the presentation, how do we actually develop cultural competence? There's a number of ways that you can really do this. And so, as I mentioned earlier, developing, moving up a stage takes 40 to 60 hours of targeted, individual, and specific, reflective time where you're deliberately focusing on what you're learning about cultural differences. So there's a number of different ways that people can do this. Certainly, many organizations provide training programs. There are many training programs that are out there available from multiple different types of educational institutions and nonprofit organizations. In personal interactions, you'll often be encountering people who are culturally different. And so it's just important to really pay attention to what you're observing about these differences and how things are playing out, how people might be experiencing your organization differently than the way you experience it. Site visits, if you can go and visit other locations and kind of take note of the different cultural groups that are, interacting in those different sites, that's an important way of helping your own learning as well. Getting involved in workplace activities, and you'll hear people will sometimes poo-poo the idea of having multicultural potluck lunches. Those are an important part of focus on diversity and inclusion and building cultural competence, but they can't be the only thing that your organization does. So that's where we hear sometimes people will poop this idea. But there's some interesting science around a multicultural potluck. One is that when your brain is trying at new foods, you're actually open to learning, which is quite interesting. It can be a way to just bring people together to sort of celebrate cultural differences in a non-threatening way that can really help them be more open and understanding. And it's very, very useful for people who are in minimization as one of the many pillars that you're going to use in your organization to help develop cultural competence and build respect for diversity and inclusion. As I said, it can't be the only thing your organization is doing. There's lots of other workplace activities that your organization can do, recognizing different theme months, recognizing different major celebration days of different cultures as they come up throughout the year, and helping people to learn about what they are and what they're about and why these things are valuable to the groups that celebrate them is all part of helping to develop cultural competence for yourself and your colleagues. Travel is a great one, but one of the things about travel is making sure that you're being very reflective of the differences that you're experiencing in the different places that you travel to. One of the things that I found interesting is in doing cultural competence development with senior leaders of organizations, as you can imagine, a lot of them are wealthy white men who are well-traveled because they're in, corporate settings, and they say, I've had tons of travel. How can I not be more culturally competent than this report is finding me? Well, what's often happening there is that they're, going to fancy hotels where everybody's catering to them, and especially if they're going to a culture that is very description-focused, very status-focused, then if this guy's coming in and he's the highest status guy in the room, everyone's bending over backwards to accommodate him. So he doesn't really have to do a great deal of accommodating of others. So the travel can be a great way of learning about other cultures, provided that you're actually interacting with people, the local people, to see how they live, to see how different nuances of culture play out, and you know, having real authentic interactions as opposed to staying in a 5-star hotel where everybody's catering to Western visitors. So the travel can be great, provided that you're being quite reflective about what you're learning there. The Intercultural Journal is one of the best things that I recommend when people are trying to develop in their cultural understanding. And what you should do here is start a journal where you're, you know, actually writing down the things that you're learning about cultural differences, about yourself, and about what you're observing as you go forward. And one of the things that you can do here are, you know, when you're involved in an intercultural misunderstanding, after it's done, write down what happened, who said what, where did it go off the rails, how could it have been handled differently, what could you have done differently, what could the other person have done differently, what might you do differently in the future. If you are observing intercultural conflict between other people, then you could journal out about, you know, what was said, who said what escalated it, what made it better. If you were in a position to intervene, did you? How did that go? How did it make you feel? As you start journaling about these things, and you journal about your workplace activities, and your travel, and your personal interactions, and the training programs, and the cultural events that you're doing, as you journal about this, you'll start to actually see, you know, evidence of your own development, your own change in understanding, which is quite a beautiful thing to be able to look back at and see that evidence of your own development. Cultural events is a huge one, and you know, most of us live in multicultural cities around Ontario. There's lots of cultures. There's lots of cultural celebrations. How often do you go to a cultural celebration that's not your own? I would encourage you to take advantage of the cultural celebrations that are happening in the communities in which you live, and go out and encourage others, and get out there and see what happens in cultural celebrations. Is the things that different cultures celebrate are representative of their values, their deep mythology. And on the surface, a lot of our cultural celebrations seem kind of ridiculous unless you understand the deeper meaning. Like, for example, it seems ridiculous to cut down a tree and put it in your house and cover it with lights and baubles and things, and put colored boxes under it, and then take all the colored boxes out from under it, and take all the lights and baubles out, and then throw the tree out on your curb. If you don't understand the deep meaning that people have for Christmas, and what the Christmas tree means to them, then all of that ritual might seem ridiculous. But, and this is similar when you don't understand the cultural celebrations and rituals of other cultures, because we're looking at it from the surface and we're not looking at the deeper meaning behind it. So when we start to learn what the deeper meaning is behind these things, we have a greater understanding for what people value and what moves them, and what's important to them. And that helps us be more understanding in our intercultural communications, and building relationships with other people, and responding to our communities, especially when we're in the cultural sector, where we're trying to respond to our communities, trying to reflect what's happening in our communities and our museums. So really important that we be involved in the cultural events, maybe hosting cultural events in your museums. Books, I have a couple I'm going to recommend for you in a few slides here. Certainly great way to develop your understanding of cultural competence. There's a number of books I can recommend. I'll start with 3 so as not to overload you. The next piece I want to talk about is just some goals that you can set if you're developing cultural competence. So the first is developing an investigative, non-judgmental, you sort of seek to understand attitude toward all kinds of difference. So when you see people who are different from you, you really need to give the benefit of the doubt. Help and just be open to understanding what those differences are. Challenging yourself to develop a greater acceptance for ambiguity. This is very, very hard for most people. We like to have things very clear, and we categorize people, and we want to know what it is. It's very difficult to accept ambiguity, but sometimes that's where some of the greatest learning comes from, when we're open to the ambiguity. We really need to learn to understand the assumptions and values upon which your own behavior rests. So understanding your worldview, understanding what your biases are. We all have biases. Many of our biases are created by the culture we were raised in, but we all have biases. We have literally dozens of biases operating in our brains at any given time. Unconscious bias is another whole training session, but it's important for us to recognize that we have them and that they're going to affect the way we approach others. people the benefit of the doubt. Most people are not bad or out to get you. They're actually operating from what they think is the appropriate way to operate based on their worldview. And so when we encounter people who are approaching things differently, then we really need to give the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're coming at it from what they think is the right way to do things, and they're not out to get you, but they just have a different approach, and we really need to unpack what that is and come to a mutual adaptation or understanding. Some things that you can do, some practices that you can do to develop your cultural competences. Making a conscious decision to establish friendships with people who are different than you. Many of us, our circle of friends looks a lot like us. And if you look at people's Facebook list of friends, you'll often see that their list of friends looks a lot like them. It's important for us to actually seek out and develop friendships and get to know people who are different than us. That's helpful for us in our development in so many different ways. Put yourself in situations where you're going to meet people or encounter other cultural practices. So getting involved in multicultural groups, getting involved in different cultural celebrations, going and attending cultural celebrations, all of these are ways that you can actually give yourself opportunity to encounter people who are different. Ask people questions about their cultures and customs and views, and create an organizational culture where it's okay to talk about cultural differences. This is a challenging thing to do. It is something that is possible, and I am aware of a few organizations that really work hard to make it okay to talk about cultural differences. And this is important because then when you have cultural misunderstanding, you have the freedom or the ability to actually have a conversation about that and unpack it and come to a good solution. And encourage other people to do these things too. So the slide here is I have provided a couple of books that you might want to consider reading if you want to develop more in this area. The first is called Basic Concepts of Intercultural Communication, and it's written and introduced by Dr. Milton Bennett, who's the guy who developed the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. There's a number of chapters in there by other renowned interculturalists as well. And so it's a really great book. When I was being trained as a cross-cultural trainer at Hewitt many, many years ago, every cross-cultural trainer had to read this entire book in order to even be certified as a trainer. Writing the Ways of Culture by Fons Trompenaar and Charles Hampton Turner goes into great depth into those dimensions of culture, how they came up with them, and how they play out in different contexts. So it's a great one to really understand the way different cultures approach different situations and how these might be playing out in the communities around your museums. Retaining and promoting culturally different employees gets at the heart of how you actually do this within organizations. It's written by a Canadian, Lionel LaRoche, and it's a great book in terms of looking at how our organizations are often designed for people from a particular culture to be successful, and people from other cultures have to do a great deal of adapting in order to be successful in those organizations. So this will help you understand some of those nuances as they play out within organizations. And those are just a few books, but they're some of the best regarded books in the field. And certainly if you're interested in learning more, I can provide a lot more suggestions, but that's a good start. So the final word here is you don't have to be an expert. To be culturally effective doesn't mean that you're an authority in the values and beliefs of every culture. What it means is that you hold a deep respect for cultural differences, and you're eager to learn and willing to accept that there are many other ways of viewing the world. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the presentation and open up the Q&A session, and I'll hand it back over to Rhiannon to moderate.
Yeah, so now we have some time for questions. If anybody has them, you can type them into the chat box and send them, and I will sort of relay them to Kathy. I did know there was one question earlier. I made a comment about how sense of identity changes from work to home. And I think there had been a question, does it have to do with acting differently at work versus home?
Sure. I mean, that's just an example of how we adapt, right?
Right.
And again, it can play out in terms of whether or not we are more aligned with being task-oriented or relationship-oriented. So some people who are very task-oriented will be quite keep their lives separate, their home life quite separate from their work life. Some people who are more relationship-oriented may see more of a melding between those different realms of their life. But also it can play out in terms of how much adapting we do, or how much we feel we need to do adaptation in different in different contexts, right? So that it's very personalized and can be based on a number of things, but certainly culture can play into that in terms of whether you're in a more task-oriented culture or a more relationship-oriented culture, in terms of how much you actually change your behavior between home and work life.
I've got another question here. So Sheriff Blackman is wondering if you can speak to the challenges and opportunities of embedding diversity and inclusion.
That's a very large question. Certainly, this is exactly what CCI works with organizations for. We are working with about 200 organizations across Canada right now, many as employer partners, many as clients who are where we assess the inclusivity of their organization through multiple measurement and analytics tools, and we develop diversity strategies, training, change management strategies to help embed diversity and inclusion in organizations. Some of the challenges, well, one of the first challenges is the fact that most people are in minimization. And one of the other biggest challenges is that in most organizations that we've looked at, the senior leadership team and the HR team actually think the organization is more inclusive than the average of all employees, a wide margin. And then when you actually start comparing the differences in perception of the inclusivity of the organization between senior leadership teams and those from equity-seeking groups, then we sometimes see very, very big gaps. And this plays to the fact that sometimes people with privilege, social privilege, and people with organizational privilege, so those in the leadership team that have the perks and the influence and the access to information that others don't have in the organization, don't really recognize how other people might be experiencing society or their organizations differently from the way that they're experiencing it. And so part of our learning is to help people understand the fact that different people have very different experiences. Some people are experiencing harassment and discrimination in their organizations, and some people are not, and not even aware that other people are experiencing that. And, you know, when you have people who have privilege, who are in minimization, they're simply not paying attention to this stuff. So part of it is increasing awareness. One of the challenges is increasing awareness. The opportunities in increasing awareness for many people in senior leadership positions is one thing that we do a lot is explaining the business case to them as to why this is important to their organization and how not paying attention to it is a detriment to their organization. And sometimes that can help them sort of wake up a little bit and recognize the importance. So, the other challenge we hear a lot about is just the resources and the time and the effort that are dedicated to this in many organizations. In many organizations, it's being done on the side of someone's desk in HR, or there might be one person who's dedicated to diversity and inclusion, and it's an awful lot on their shoulders, and they're often under-resourced for this kind of work. So that's a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question here. So from Jess Mitchell. So she was saying, 46 hours requires quite a willingness and eagerness of someone to change. And few people have that. So how can we have an impact on agree to disagree and tolerating difference when there's simply no sense that there is any growth necessary?
Great question. Part of it is recognizing that we need to help people move forward from where they're at. And so when we are hearing people saying very polarizing, racist-style statements, we need to work at saying minimization-style statements to help them move forward. When we hear people saying minimization-style statements, we have to say acceptance-style statements to help them move forward. There's a number of different organizations that we work with where they're actually creating inclusive behavior or cultural competences as performance competencies that people are being rated on. That is one way of encouraging people to have to pay more attention to this. If it's something that they're actually being measured on their performance, that's going to pay more attention. As the old phrase goes, what gets measured gets done, right? The other thing is, when people are exhibiting intolerant behaviors, at least in the organizations that we work in most organizations there's a code of conduct or a set, respectful behavior that you can fall back on, and at the very least you can fall back on there are human rights violations when people behave in intolerant ways in workplaces. So even if a person is exhibiting intolerant behaviors, we can always fall back on, if they're not going to recognize the value of becoming a better communicator, of developing cultural competence, if you don't have performance measures related to cultural competence or inclusion, you can always fall back on that. That kind of behavior and comment is simply not tolerated in this organization, and you can't do it here. So we can't always change people's minds, but we can sometimes fall back on some of the minimum standard of respectful behavior that you expect in our workplaces and in our institutions in Canada. It's not necessarily the best solution. We would really like everybody to recognize the value and be driving themselves to move forward. But as people who understand these things, we need to kind of recognize where people are at and help to influence them in the best way that we can.
Perfect.
I hope
it
that's
looks
helpful.
like we've got, in the chat, we've also got some sort of suggestions that people made there as well, so people can take a look at that.
That's a great suggestion about being an active listener as a good way of being culturally competent.
Yeah. So we have another question. So this is from Roberta. So it says, how do we stay accepting and respectful of other cultures when it goes against the fundamentals of our own? For example, women in the workplace or gay marriage. And then I see Jess sort of responded and said, I would go further and say this is not only goes against cultural expectations but basic human rights. So really, how do you draw the line and say this isn't acceptable as a culturally relevant issue?
Those are great questions, and those are some of the most challenging things that we're dealing with in Canadian society as we have such a melding of cultures. I think that we always need to fall back on being respectful of individuals that we're dealing with. In some cases, we need to fall back on the laws and the human rights of our society. So where individual differences might not agree with human rights and laws, we do have codes of conduct. We have codes of respectful behavior. We have the Ontario Human Rights Code. We have the Canadian Human Rights, the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, that provides protections against certain kinds of treatment in our society. So there's an expectation that people are going to behave respectfully in our institutions and in our society. It's harder to enforce that in our society. It's easier to enforce that in our institutions when people are behaving in ways that actually infringes upon the rights of others. One of the sort of underlying approaches to this is that you can exercise your own rights until they infringe on the rights of others. A challenge has come up in case law in Canada where you have what's often referred to as competing rights, where one person's right is infringing on the right of another, and different organizations have handled this well and not very well in different circumstances. And so it depends on the province you're in. In some cases, new protected grounds are being added to the provincial human rights codes, and in some cases, precedent in case law is deciding how these things should be determined. For the most part, it's being respectful and ensuring that that people are not being disrespectful of each other in our workplaces and in our organizations, especially where we're being governed by codes of conduct and human rights codes. I hope that helps.
So we have another question from Jacqueline. So the question is, championing diversity and inclusion can be exhausting, and investing 40 to 60 hours to help move someone from one to the next is a lot. So the question is, what advice would you give to diversity and inclusion practitioners to maintain perspective and avoid burnout?
Well, avoiding the burnout thing, if anybody else figures that out, I'd appreciate sharing. It's an uphill battle. It's always going to be challenging. You're always going to be encountering people who who are saying really disrespectful things, and you have to maintain a respectful demeanor. Certainly the 40 to 60 hours guideline is if you're specifically trying to develop cultural competence, and if you're developing cultural competence in your organization, then you can start to think about some of the training and activities and the kinds of things that you're doing with people in your organization as all part of that. It's not intended that you're going to spend 40 to 60 hours with one individual developing them, but you can give them training, you can do activities in your organization, you can point them to developmental activities that they can do on their own. And so it really is, it's an individual practice. But you're right, focusing on diversity and inclusion in your organization is challenging. It is a change management activity. So one thing I would strongly recommend is that you learn about change management methodology. I have been certified in a change management methodology called ADKAR. There are many of them others out there that really talks about how you implement change in an organization. And diversity and inclusion is a change activity. It is trying to change people's behaviors and beliefs. We can't always change their beliefs. We can often change their behaviors by explaining what is appropriate within our institutions. But in the ADKAR approach, it talks about how we need to build awareness of the need for the change. We need to build a desire for people to participate in and support the change. Then we need to help them build knowledge and ability on how to change and how to implement the change and have new skills and behaviors. And then constant reinforcement. So there's a lot of things that you can do to help you be better at this. And the other thing I would say is you really need to focus on resilience and self-care. Because it is challenging, it is tiring, being the champion for diversity in your organization. And sometimes there are days when you want to say something inappropriate to somebody. There are days when you just want to curl up and go, oh my God, I can't take this crap anymore. But it is important that you stay strong and that you take care of yourself so that you can continue to be strong for others. And if you're taking on this road, it's not going to be easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding when you look back after years of working in an organization and see that things are changing, and that can be very rewarding. And also just knowing that you're doing the right thing to help your fellow human beings to have a more inclusive environment in which to live. It's very important. So I would suggest self-care. If anyone has any other suggestions, please do share them. And back to you, Rhiannon.
Okay, so we just have, so this I think is the last question here. So this question's from Anita. So it's sort of, can you address the difference between recognizing and appreciating cultural differences versus having stereotypes of individuals who come from different cultural groups?
Okay, so first is recognizing that the differences exist, right? So when most people are in minimization, they don't even recognize that the differences exist. And that's and understanding the depth of those differences. Now, having stereotypes, this is a really challenging area in cultural competence development because sometimes you have, lists of, when you're talking to Chinese people, do this and don't do that. That becomes very stereotypical because, as we saw, we all have multiple complex impacts to our own cultural identity. So while it's important to recognize that the differences exist, the challenge that you have to have is when you're interacting with an individual, you need to recognize that that individual has been impacted by many, many different cultural and identity dimensions, and that will impact their worldview. So they might not align or adhere to the worldview of their sort of cultural group that you believe that they belong to. And so it's really important that we get to know individuals if we're going to be able to communicate more effectively with them. So the main thing is approaching individuals with the idea that they might have quite a different worldview from you and that you need to unpack what that is and learn how to adapt to them as individuals. It helps.
Yeah, I think that's great. All right, so we're just going to sort of finish up here. So thank you. Here is Kathy's information, and we will have a recording of this webinar as well as the slides available. So here's Kathy's information if you'd like to contact her. And I'd like to thank Kathy for sharing with us today, and thank you again to all of our project partners, the Royal Ontario Museum and the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration for their support on this webinar. Thank you to everyone who signed in today and for your participation. So when we leave the webinar, you will be directed to a short evaluation form. So if you can please take a few minutes to let us know how we did today, that would be great. We do hope to see everyone again on October 18th for our second webinar, which will be on regional approaches to diversity and inclusion. And we will also have another webinar in November that will be on the topic of ADKAR. So I did see there was a little bit of a conversation going on about the change management. So do sort of keep posted on the newsletters. We will be letting you know when that next webinar is going to take place, and that will be on the 29th of November. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
And those of you who shared resources and for your participation today.